I'm the founder and creative director of LightShed. It's a social impact virtual reality startup. And I was going to just take you through a little bit of a journey of my experiences with virtual reality. I've been very fortunate to have been one of the first people to experiment with live action 360 virtual reality that was able to, I did a lot of that initial work with the United Nations, and I made Clouds Over Sidra, which was one of the UN's first VR documentary, which some of you may have seen already. So I'm just going to take you through it. I hope this works. Great. This talk is kind of funny, so don't be afraid to laugh. And heckle me too if you want. So the first part I want to go through is when I was able to be fortunate enough to work with some of the early VR rigs and to think about what we would want to do with this new medium and what kind of stories we'd want to tell. I think there was a lot of unknowns about what this new powerful medium could do on topics of great concern. And for me, when we had decided that we were going to do something on the Syrian refugee crisis, I knew that VR wouldn't be the first time that we would be facing this sort of dilemma of how, as I like to say, kind of represent the pain of others. And, it's not the first time that this is happening, but representing the pain of others is alluding to an amazing book by Susan Sontag called Regarding the Pain of Others, which I think a lot of these ideas are influenced by, and it was a really big influence for me. I'm also a New Yorker. Susan Sontag is kind of this, incredible figure, and for me, a lot of her writing on photography, on thinking about what makes us react to images, I think was something that was fundamental for me, and it was fundamental on how I thought we should approach telling stories in virtual reality that did that. This is not, of course, the first time that we are always trying to tell stories and try to say what's happening in places we haven't been to. And it's interesting because it's only through photography and now VR where that element of photorealism is coming in, where we have this assumption that the more real things feel and the more we're able to feel this suffering and see it and witness it, it would in some ways prevent these things from happening. But there is something to the abstract nature of how, whether it's with cave paintings or even with war paintings from the Napoleonic era, that still can be something we shouldn't take for granted and forget about. I don't know if any of you have seen or read the graphic novel Mouse by, which is on the Holocaust. And in it, the very simple act of the artist deciding to represent people through animals, whether it's through, making certain people as cat or mice or dogs. It seems absurd, but, I think we need to kind of think about some of that there is, even though we're moving into a photorealist world, that there is something to art and storytelling that we'll try to bring in. This is one of the earliest sort of pictures from the American Civil War when photography started coming on. And it was the first time where people were feeling, okay, we're going to try to show, a kind of suffering that one hadn't seen before. And, you were starting to get these types of images that I think people had never felt before. And the idea by a lot of these images was that if only we can share this with people, if only people can see this, war will stop and suffering will stop. So when I was going out there in Zaatari refugee camp and some of the other films that I've been very fortunate to be able to do, I was thinking about it in this way where I just felt just showing the suffering was not going to be enough, that we had to do something a bit more, I think, creative in that way. So, you know, in a lot of ways, people would say that World War I would be the first sort of photographed war, where photography played an outsized role on our relationship to violence and to that event. Vietnam is considered by many where television and television images coming into your living rooms has this sort of impact on you in different ways. Syria, similarly, if you go on YouTube, would probably be the first YouTubed war where you have these user-generated sort of images from cell phones of very horrific things. And when I've, you know, talked with a lot of Syrian activists, and, you know, I think, you know, there's been a lot of sort of work on that. A lot of them actually intuitively feel that if only the world could see these horrible things, maybe then we would do something to stop it. But if there's a thesis to this talk, or the first part of it, is that that's not entirely true. You know, and in Black Lives Matter, I think, you know, it's the first time where you're in live sort of ways able to see horrible things. So, you know, it's important to think about where VR will be in a lot of this, and think about how we would bring some of that. And I think the sort of idea for a lot of people is to work in that more sensational way. And that wasn't necessarily the approach that I felt would work. This is also very, very fascinating. It's a book called War Against War, and it was actually 40 of the worst images from World War I that became a bestseller in Germany in 1930, and was in many different languages and many different editions, passed around with that same sort of thing. If only we can actually have people read this and see this and experience it, we would not be so foolish as to continue to go on the path we do. But it didn't necessarily have that effect, you know, with going forward. And Susan Sontag does write a lot about that. You know, these are some footages from Vietnam. I have a lot of videos in here that will prevent me from having to bore you with my lecture. And, you know, these are some things that you can go on YouTube with Syria that was happening. I won't play too much of it because it is a bit gruesome with what's happening. So why doesn't it work? And this is from Facebook. One of it is we grow numb to sensational images. Like, you might see something horrible happen, but there is this kind of freezing up where it doesn't necessarily have the same impact of you. If you're exposed to that over and over, you're not necessarily going to keep caring or keep being motivated to do it. And this doesn't just come from, you know, photography or anything. I mean, there's a lot of things in public health that's very helpful. You know, there's a lot of studies in the beginning where people didn't want you to smoke or to have, you know, certain practices that are bad for your health. You know, there was the intuitive thing, let's just show you a skeletal body, or let's just show you scary things. And there's, you know, a whole host of evidence that, you know, those types of ways don't necessarily get you to change your behavior for your health. And if you're trying to motivate people to care about others and to do something about it, it's probably not the best way to go about it. But, you know, like I said, you know, storytelling and metaphor and ways that you're able to bring things, I think, are really important. And this is, you guys know this, or am I dating myself? It's like dad rock, you know? So, you know, something like this was more effective because it's this metaphor and the egg in your brain. And I actually, you know, this is probably more effective than just showing somebody, you know, like dying of an overdose in an alleyway. And I think, you know, similarly, I think we need to have that kind of approach with all of our storytelling, but in VR in particular, I think it's important to be even more sensitive to that, given it's so immersive, so, you know, it has this new potential. I'm gonna start walking around now, this is great. All right. And, you know, this one I had to throw in. It's a little gratuitous, but I just thought it was hilarious. Maybe it should be updated with, like, an iPhone or something like that now. But again, you get the point. I'm just gonna keep that on there. And I think it is that passivity and it is that numbness that I think is really difficult. There is this way that after a while it's not making you active if you're going to just have these shocking and sensational images. This is another picture of Aylan, the 3-year-old boy. In some ways, you have to ask yourself, this is very shocking, but it was shocking because it came through our social media platforms. But, is it going to continue to have the same effect in that way? This is some of, the approach that UNICEF had taken originally in the 70s and 80s, where, again, with every new medium and in every way, the idea is if we just show you horrible things, and even, places that are trying to raise money at that time, have used these images. And it's interesting because these aren't the images we use now. This is very funny.
Every year, 10 million third world children don't live to see their 3rd birthday. Those who do live beyond that ripe old age here will grow up in dung heaps like this. Happy birthday. I've been asked if I've ever gotten used to this misery. How does a human being with a heart get used to this? The heartbreaking crying of a 2-year-old so undernourished her teeth are coming loose. The sight of a child so starved he's too weak to cry. And one so dehydrated by diarrhea he doesn't even have the tears to cry with. No, I can't get used to this any more than you could, but we can get rid of it. Yes, we can. You and I, CCF.
Don't call that number. Don't call it. This should make you laugh, and it's cringeworthy, a bit. But the whole point is that was something that was working for a while, and it's not something we do now in the same way. Like UNICEF has, this is from the UNICEF page, and there's been a shift away from that, and a lot of NGOs do that. And I think a lot of people think it's because we've become more politically correct, and there's ideas of human dignity and how you do it. I think that's a part of it, but part of it is that wasn't working after a while. That's not raising, it can only go so much until you keep seeing that it's not effective. So if you go on like the UNICEF site now, it's a lot more about storytelling. It's a lot more about happy faces, and then being more subtle and nuanced with what's happening. And this is a lot more successful for fundraising too. So similarly, I think when you approach these types of story in VR, that's the kind of way I was thinking about how we could balance it. And the thing is, I actually think this goes too extreme sometimes and being a little too happy. And I think in VR, you can kind of figure out interesting ways that you can kind of mix a little bit, not sensational, but you can kind of bring in a different emotion that brings in a little bit more nuance. Why is another reason it doesn't work? We have a lustful relationship to violence. I gave this talk once somewhere, and this guy came up, and he's like, "Not me." I was like, "I'm sorry." But there is, an enormous amount of evidence that, there is this kind of, in showing horrible things in some ways too, it can just kind of sometimes have an effect of attracting you to it, but not necessarily making you empowered to do something about it, that you get addicted to kind of seeing some of these things. And, some of our media and some of our myths and other things, I think, play on that. And I think, of course, when I was going into VR, people, said, well, it's about gaming and guns and violence. And those things are going to continue to have that, because I do think there's some sort of biological sort of perverse attraction we have that doesn't necessarily fulfill the goal of getting us to do something about an issue. Finally, it can be exploited. And what do I mean by that? If I show you a horrible thing of a certain person from a certain part of a conflict or a certain race being in a bad situation or being murdered or other things, that might be something that you feel empathy towards, but on someone on the other side, they could actually feel very happy, or they can use it as propaganda. And this is just some examples of similar things and people watching the same horrible thing for very different reasons and having very different reactions. So going in the sensational sort of way is not something that is always going to be something that's going to work for you in the long run. So the same picture of Aylan, that was, mobilized Europe was used by ISIS as propaganda of what would happen if you did leave, And I think it's about thinking about how you can build something that's a little bit different, and, that's where I think some of the work, we've been trying to focus on. So just to sum up a bit, I think sensational, shocking pictures, I think they kill storytelling. Some of the best examples I know is the Shoah documentary by Cloud Landsman, which uses no archival footage, yet is able to engage this sort of empathy through storytelling and interviews that I think is very interesting. That what's considered one of the greatest works on the Holocaust is actually something that didn't necessarily need those pictures of horrible things happening. And that's something to really, I think, keep in mind if you go ahead and go into this. It seems obvious, but actually I butt heads all the time with a lot of people on a lot of this issue, and I'm not going to say I'm totally right. I'm just going to tell you that this is my inclination and why I think some of the work we've been able to be a part of, or I've been able to be a part of, has that kind of empathy quality to it. I think because you need the imagination, and without imagination, there's no empathy. I'm team empathy, by the way, and I'm not afraid of that word. I just want to say that. I want to leave you with some interesting examples so you can kind of feel that it can be, this uses YouTube footage from Syria, but weaves it in this elegant way through a voiceover and story and meaning that I think show you how one can kind of build something. It's called Silvered Water, and a very underrated film, but it's one that you should definitely seek out. Of course, this very famous picture from the Depression. The story of this subject, too, is really fascinating, which I think you can go further into. But something like this, again, makes you kind of imagine and think of what's happening and having to kind of put your own sort of emotions and stories into something that I think is really great. In some of my research, my most recent experience is a walk-around experience in the Holocaust called The Last Goodbye that world premiered in the Tribeca Film Festival. And in doing research, I had to kind of, look at what pictures were there and what was going on. And I was in Poland, and these pictures in themselves, I think, are what they are. But the caption in the museum was that this is the last moment before people were being pushed into the gas chamber, and you end up looking at it and having goosebumps in a different way. So you can kind of, build a lot of that, and I think, with a lot of the stories we tell, we try to bring that in. This part, I think, is a little bit about during my time at the UN, and I think it's important to kind of think about it because we've been able to have a certain amount of impact with the work that I think for a very new medium like VR, there's all this talk about, there's no audience, the headsets. Why invest in it? Why do that until you can, get people to watch it? What would be the thing? And to me, in having to make that case at the UN, it wasn't very easy because at the time, and this was about the late 2014, there were no headsets, there were no apps. And here it is, wanting to kind of push forward with something that, in retrospect feels like, wow, what vision. But to me, I was being motivated by my first VR experience, that I could feel that it was the future, that it was going to change things. And I just felt that if we did something that could get people to care about something in a way that I never felt before, even if we changed a couple of people's minds, or maybe if they were decision makers, it would change it. And the traditional way that we would get people to care about things a lot was really starting to frustrate me, which is these guys, and celebrities or traditional ways of doing it. And I think, it was on that path that, I thought VR in some ways, at the very least, I felt if we were able to do something compelling, eventually, the content would get out there. But what I didn't expect, and this is just, let me just skip through some of this. This is just like some of our average viewpoints. What happens when, Angelina Jolie helps you, goes a little higher. But, we're still kind of always trying to go at something that's going to have more resonance. So I just felt, let me just skip through this, I'm sorry. I want to bring this up because I was a part of the team that was helping to co-produce Humans of New York's UN tour. And Brandon Stanton is a genius. He's incredible and a good friend. And to me, I think a lot of the VR work that I was able to spearhead in the beginning was influenced by this. And my sort of, again, pitch with working with VR and new media was that this one person had more followers probably than all of the UN's social media accounts combined. Yet it was also his sort of idiosyncratic way of dealing with stories that I think we were able to bring in with Clouds Over Sidra. So, has anyone seen Clouds Over Sidra? Yeah. So I'm so happy. You can watch it on the Within app. So, this was some of our ways. And, there's a lot of talk about empathy, and I know it's like, I feel like, really uncomfortable now because it's become this bad word, where, people feel it's overused and everything. But I think a lot of it is going to be different if you actually think about what your definition of empathy is or what you're meaning when you say it. And for me, it was helpful to kind of think about what we were trying to say and how we were trying to bring it. And I think that's what some of the Clouds Over Sidra was able to do. I think why virtual reality at the UN? So when we were able to have Clouds Over Sidra, we world premiered it at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And we put it on all these decision makers and billionaires and kings and queens. And for me, it was amazing because there weren't that many headsets, and somehow we were able to convince Samsung to give us 150 headsets. And they brought a team of 8 people from Korea that were putting it on everybody's head. And to me, I just thought, well, this is great performance art, like this is like cool, weird thing that you have these people in this elite environment in this town in Switzerland, and they're able to go to a refugee camp. And afterwards, we did it. I was like, that was great. Now I'm going to go on to the rest of my life and other things that I do. And I didn't expect it to continue to have the same impact. And at some point, I want to play this video. This was an idea that we came up with UNICEF. UNICEF was like, well, we have these face-to-face fundraisers in 40 different countries, working in 15 different languages, and there are people who stop you in the street. And these are some of the volunteers and some of the people in New Zealand. And and this was the first video I got back, where they said, why don't we try to integrate VR with the cheaper headsets? So if people stop you, usually it's a 1 in 12 chance that someone will give money to UNICEF if they don't have a VR headset. But there was a way with like Google Cardboard and these other plastic sort of things where a lot of these volunteers have smartphones. The Within app had come out, and people could download it. And all of a sudden, like, well, let's see if it makes their job easier. Let's make it something that some people could stop and give you this VR experience and see if it changes it. And so before I tell you some of the statistics around it, these were some of the reactions just from the volunteers who were exploring this new tool. And I really thought something was going on.
The girl in the video was only like a few years younger than me, and the boys running around were my brother's age.
It gave me a real sense of appreciation for what I've got here.
I felt as if I was actually there, and I could actually feel the pain of the children and their suffering.
Made the people seem so alive, and I think that's really important with this. The people have to be alive in order for change to happen.
It was something that I don't want to believe is happening, but I can't ignore it anymore.
I knew about what was going on, but I didn't really know the extent of everything that happened there.
Open one arm and then the other, and then walk towards a person and then hug them.
What are you doing? Like, why are basic human rights still being denied in the 21st century? Why are there still people falling dead on the streets? Why do humans feel the need for war?
My sorrow is one based on, me coming to school when it's raining. For them, it's not even being able to go to school.
Yeah, it really makes you feel for what's happening in that situation.
They said that it will kind of pass, like the clouds, and I thought that was really inspiring.
How they can just find happiness in a place where there's not going to be much these were other girls like me going through it and actually thinking and feeling how they are feeling.
There's just so much children who need our help and so much people we need to reach out to.
So, and then we got some great press too, I forgot to say. This is actually a real quote from the New Yorker, I swear to God. I'm not making it up. You can check it out. When that started happening, I was really impressed, and then we were able to do some measurements and data of a lot of what was happening, and it turns out that rather than 1 in 12, 1 in 6 people were giving. It was doubling donations, and it's something that I think is probably, well, maybe if I had a microphone, I'd drop it, you know? It was a real sort of indication that, you know, that there is something about VR and this type of storytelling. Now, the problem is, as we tend to be seduced by technology, I think a lot of people felt it was the VR, and I kept trying to remind people that there was a philosophy to how we were trying to tell these stories, and that it was a good story, you know, and that we had partnered, and I had worked with some of the best producers and minds in VR storytelling in the world, and that had to have been a part of it, right? Like, it wasn't just VR, and I think that's been very good, but I think what's happened after that is that it's almost started a kind of empathy arms race in some ways with a lot of other NGOs to, oh, let's try to double donations because that's what VR does, but they're not realizing that the stories and the way we're trying to tell them are also just as important as the technology itself, and it's that combination. We've also did something called the Cedra Project in Canada, working with you know, recently resettled, refugees coming into the country, working with host communities and building empathy and showing very similar good results, but in a different type of way. And, you know, we also bring them to festivals, you know, and we were at the White House and all that stuff that we were able to do. This is just a little bit of gives you an example of what it's like when people show it on the street and how it works, just to give you a sense of how this is working. But, you know, a lot of impact is not just about money. You know, it's about also shaping and changing hearts and minds and everything. And so we did something called My Mother's Wing, which is about a mother in Gaza, and we were able to show it on the streets of Tel Aviv and do questionnaires and try to see if it changed people's baseline knowledge or changed their opinion on giving them more information or more sort of a different perspective on the conflict. And that's also shown some very good preliminary results. And just to show that, you know, when we build these sort of campaigns, they're all very different. And what you mean by impact can be money, but it can have very different ways to do it. Just as another impact thing, The Last Goodbye was a way that we were able to kind of bring testimony on the Holocaust in a way where it was a big deal when the Shoah Foundation made their first video testimony. They have 55,000 of them, of a lot of survivors. And we worked together to try to make the first one in VR, to be archived and preserved for the future. And so this thing, a lot of you might be familiar with Clouds Over Cedra or the other ones that I've done, where it's 360 and you can just look around. But you know, we were able to use, and I know Emblematic Group, and you know, you just had this presentation, we were able to do a photogrammetry of Majdanek concentration camp, which means that it's completely recreated through photos of it being the real place. And you put on a Vive and you can walk around, and we were able to actually merge in the survivor to give you that kind of tour and give you that story. So I just want to leave on like a short sort of behind-the-scenes trailer on that experience that will probably be available for download at the end of the year, and will have its international premiere at the Venice Film Festival. So I'm just going to now embarrassingly go through all this, which is awesome, which I wish I could show you, which is about presence, and we're going to just go back here, and here we go. I'm going to play this. I make virtual reality films in 360 degrees, stuff you can watch in a headset. My other films have been on pretty big, serious social issues, like the refugee crisis, the Ebola crisis. Most of my films up until now, they bring you into another world, but it's not a world you can necessarily walk around. And this project is, really pushing the boundaries of what it means to be in virtual reality. I really felt this type of technology would be really powerful for genocide survivors. There's this need for testimony. There's this need to share. There's this need to educate, but also to bring you there and to have them take you there. Pincus was one of the few people to survive this camp. I mean, today we film in the shower room that he was brought when he was 11 years old on the day that the rest of his family members were killed. And in the experience, you're going to be in the shower room with him. Up until now, if you need to move around in virtual reality, they're usually computer-generated images. This project gave us the possibility to explore with some cutting-edge technology what it would be like to be in a certain place, but also with someone else who would be able to be your guide. You are able to be confined to a certain space, and with a headset, you can explore that space, and it really is hacking your senses. I think these types of experiences, they will give a different type of feeling that one doesn't get in traditional documentary or traditional film. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.